Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 11th of January of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, geolocations, we have a lot of very interesting corrections on map, so let's start. But before we start talking about the situation on the ground, the most important updates are coming from Kiev. And the important one is that Ukraine's parliament hasn't managed to adopt the mobilization law for the second or third time in a row. They found a lot of things that doesn't have a lot of problems with the constitution of Ukraine, so that's why they took a decision to return this law back for more improvements. And this is very important because, as I understand, the Ukrainian authorities parliament doesn't want to be responsible for this law because they understand that this law breaks the human rights and many other different things. And obviously the Ukrainian parliament wants to achieve some goals. As I understand, and as you know, the Zelensky term ends on the 31st of March as the president of Ukraine. So as I understand, the Ukrainian parliament is trying to adopt the law as close as possible to this date and to give Zelensky possibilities to sign the law after the law will be adopted by the parliament, let's say on the 1st of April. Exactly on the date when, according to the law, Zelensky is no longer a president of Ukraine. So probably this will save and will probably give some chances and opportunities to survive for the deputy of parliament, because from one side they managed to adopt the law, but from the other side the law was signed by the person who doesn't have rights for this. So they will always have possibilities to blame Zelensky in this situation, and that this is not their fault. They did everything they must, but this is not their responsibility why the law was signed by a person who doesn't have power to do this. Another important update is coming from the United States of America, and according to information we have, Republicans have developed the Ukraine victory plan. This is a very important thing, a very important piece of news, because as we know, the Democracy Party was the party who was supporting Ukraine and who was standing with Ukrainians in the war with Russia. I was very surprised that Republicans have developed anything for Ukraine, and in this development we can find three words: Ukraine, victory, and plan. But this plan has a few important, let's say, paragraphs. The first one is the quick provision, which means that quick provision of critical weapons, including ATACMS for 300 kilometers, F-16, cluster munition, artillery, air defense, and armored vehicles. The second point is the strengthening of sanctions against Russia, and the third, final one, transfer to Ukraine of 300 billion of frozen assets of the Russian Federation. Of course, the last one is the most important because, as you know, as you understand, the Ukrainians will not get even a cent from these 300 billions. Every single dollar, every single cent will stay in the United States of America and its allies, because this money will be invested in the production, military production. The United States will produce F-16 tanks, missiles, air defense, rounds, artillery shells, everything Ukraine needs, and all these material assets will be transferred to Ukraine. This is the schema. So basically the Ukrainians will not see even a single dollar from this money. Furthermore, another important thing is coming from the White House, and as you know, Joe Biden he also thinks that this is a very good idea to get these $300 billion from Russia and to send them Ukraine. So as we understand, Bloomberg at least writes that the Biden administration in principle supports the confiscation of Russian assets worth $300 billion, but wants to coordinate actions with G7 countries, primarily European ones. So he has also some certain plan because United States of America doesn't want to risk. From my perspective, from my understanding, if Western countries will confiscate Russian money, Russian 300 billions, it's going to be like all-in step. It's going to be all-in because if Russia loses the war with Ukraine, Russia will agree that the Western countries made a very good thing, that they transferred Ukrainians those 300 billions, and this is like a fair deal, and we, Russia, new Russia, if Russia will lose, of course, it's going to be, if Russia loses, it's going to be the new Russia, are confirmed that those steps were very good. But if Russia wins, obviously this step will ruin the current bank system and the trust to US dollar as a currency that countries can use for transferring money and for payment purposes. So we'll see what is going to be, but the situation is getting worse and worse. Now we are moving to the situation on the ground. We will move bypass Kupiansk area because we haven't received anything from this territory, just regular clashes, regular activity, but we have a lot of updates from Liman direction. We have already discussed from this area that the Russians published the video how they were managed to discover another Ukrainian stronghold a little bit to the north from Tarskoye salient, and as you can see, according to this geolocation, the Russians were bombing the stronghold according to this map, according to the most valuable and respectful, reliable mappers. This shelling take place on the territory under Russian control, which means that at least military summary maps show not, let's say, correct information, and obviously according to this geolocation we will adjust the map and we will turn this territory under Ukraine control. This is the first thing. The second thing is that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, haven't managed to enter these tree lines, and basically they stopped somewhere else. And the question is where exactly the Russians have stopped. And today the Ukrainian sources, to be more precise, the forces of 60th Mechanized Brigade and the forces of 21st Mechanized Brigade reported and published the video how they managed to repel another Russian attack in the same area. So we have the video, geolocated video. On this scenes we can see the Russian armored fist attack, 1 tank and 2 personnel carriers that were moving in direction of Ukrainian positions. We see a few, some destroyed armored vehicles that were destroyed during the previous clashes. The Russian tank entered this tree line, they landed their infantry abandoned the armored vehicles and tried to take their positions along the tree lines. The Russian tank turned and returned back home. During the moving back, the tank got in minefields or probably was damaged by some FPV drones, probably mines, just infantry mines. So what does it mean? And this video was geolocated. We see Russian infantry, and the Ukrainians, after the Russians landed in this area, destroyed Russian tanks and armored vehicles that were abandoned by FPV drones. So if we return to the map, basically the Russian movements and the Russian let's say direction was something like this. They were moving from this tree line in direction of this tree line. Then on this tree line the Russian tanks started moving further to the north. Somewhere in this position the Russian tank returned and start moving back to the mainland in direction of Crimea. So that was the movements of the Russian tank. And somewhere in this area the Russian infantry landed, and after that those abandoned armored vehicles were destroyed also somewhere here. So this is very important. These two videos are very important, and they show us that probably as a result of Russian offensive operation in Terny, in Tarskoye salient, that took place during the late December and early January, the Russians haven't managed to establish control, but not over the territory we can see right now. And before the next video we will adjust at least this territory, and we will show this territory, some of parts of this territory under, let's say, Ukrainian control, and some parts of this territory we will show as the area in the gray zone. So something like this, and this is it. So this territory will be colored in different colors. Some part of this territory will be colored in yellow as Ukraine control, and some of these territories will be colored in the gray zone. The Russians have progressed just in a small salient. This one, they managed to get these three lines. We had geolocations of that, and just a few days ago we discussed and confirmed that the Russians haven't managed to, let's say, progress in this area as well. So very short positions, but they have a progress. So we'll see what is going to be next. Now we are moving further to the Bakhmut-Artyomovskaya direction. We have a lot of very interesting geolocations. The clashes continues between New Cemetery, Khromovo and Popovo Forest, but currently in no one's favor. The same situation in Bogdanovka. We haven't received even a single geolocation of clashes. There are clashes. Some Russian sources reported that Ukrainians withdraw their positions, but once again without any geolocations. The most important updates are coming from the southern part, from the railways. The Russians continue storming operation along the railways, trying to bypass the Ukrainians' defense belt in this territory. The main Russian purpose is to move along the railways and to attack Andreevka from the south. And for now, the Russians stuck in this area. We have a lot of geolocations during the previous days. If we increase the number of updates since the beginning of January, we can find at least 3 geolocations from the same area. The Russians were bombing this territory with artillery, with mortars, trying to destroy the Ukrainian positions on the temporary positions. Also, the Russians were attacking this territory with FPV drones and FPV drone bombing. And at the same those days, the Russians also were attacking this territory with more artillery rounds and more artillery systems. So we have that Ukrainians still control this territory and the Russians are trying to bypass, but for now they're trying to clear this territory with long range and FPV drones systems forces. But when talking about the situation in the ground, no progress. Now we are moving to Avdiivka area and we have lots of very interesting updates from the northern part of the village. According to information we have, the Russians managed to force the Ukrainians to withdraw their positions from Stepovo in direction of Berdichi. We don't have any geolocated video of Russian progress, but as I know, some Ukrainian sources have already published, before I start making the video, some photos of destroyed Russian armored vehicles on the western part of Stepovo, Petrovskaya, and according to the Russian assigned resources, as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to establish control over this territory, and currently, exactly right now, they're trying to dig in deeper. Because one thing to establish control, let's say one thing to show your presence in this area, but completely another thing whether they are able to dig in deeper, because obviously the upcoming night the Ukrainians will make another counter-offensive operation, trying to counter-attack the Russians and to force them to step back further or back to the railways. So we'll see if the Russians are able to defeat the Ukrainians. Only then we can color, of course, also if we have some geolocated videos. But from the other side, I don't see any reason why the Ukrainians need to counterattack, because if you take a look at this map, there are lots of strongholds. Two strongholds on the northwest of Stepovo, the first one. This is the first stronghold. Then right behind this stronghold, another one. To the west of Stepovo, to the south of Berdichi, also we have 2 strongholds. It's like a lot of things to do to bypass them. And we have another stronghold on the way, 2 strongholds on the way from Stepovo to the chemical plant, these ones. So there are no chances for the Russians to develop their offensive operation very fast. Obviously, they're going to have to pay, let's say, to spend significant time to bypass, but for now I think it's better for the Ukrainians to step back to save the personnel. When talking about the northern flank, we have a lot of very interesting updates. The Ukrainian sources publish FPV drone strikes against the Russian forces. We will not watch this video till the end because there are lots of episodes of I see FPV drone Russian soldiers, so lots of violence and lots of let's say problems with these things. But the most important thing that we need to note from these 2 videos is that the Russians, according to these geolocations made by the Ukrainian side, managed to concentrate critical mass, very big army among these trenches. I'm not saying about millions or hundreds of thousands, obviously not, but few hundreds, maybe a company of probably even more. The Russians managed to concentrate, and now they have time and possibilities to attack in different directions, further to the west, further to the northwest, and of course further to the north. The Russians are not going to stay in this area for a very long time, and the reason of that is let's take a look at this video once again. If the Russians are planning to stay on these trenches for too long, basically they will lose their army just as a result of FPV drone strikes. Give the Ukrainians a week of Russians in this area and nobody will survive who currently is located here. If you want to survive, I'm talking about the Russians, you need to move, you need to stand and you need to attack, because if you are take a decision to stay there, you will be always under fire of FPV drones. There are no electronic warfare equipment, I think so. And that's why the Russians will attack, and that's why we need to expect of additional progress of the Russian forces further to the west, to the north, and to the northwest. Now we are moving to Novomykhailivka. We have a lot of very interesting details and updates from this territory, and the most important one is coming from the southeastern part of the village. As you know, according to the most of the mappers, this area is already under Russian control. Lots of reliable resources are shows this territory under complete Russian control. But the thing is that yet we haven't received even a single geolocated confirmation of that. And today, on the 11th of January, we got the first one. This video was geolocated, and it's very difficult to understand what exactly is happening there. I will describe to you. On this video we can see another Ukrainian stronghold, and probably Ukrainians who were trying to hide inside of this building. They probably blocked themselves, and maybe they were waiting for some reinforcements or some forces, or I don't know what were they expecting for. And the Russian engineer got the building and he started mining this building. He put a lot of explosive, and when the time he started running away to the safe distance, and then he blown up the Ukrainian building with Ukrainians inside, which confirms the certain Russian progress. And based on that geolocation, now we have right to correct the map and to show this territory under complete Russian control. We haven't received anything from other, let's say, sectors of this white square, so we'll need to wait a little bit. Obviously, and very likely this let's say cloud is under complete Russian control, but let's stick to some logic and let's stick to some, let's say, scenario. And now we are moving to the central part of Novomykhailivka. The Russians continue FPV drone bombing of the infantry inside of this area. So the Russians continue advancing, and the situation on this area develops not in Ukraine's favor. When talking about Georgievka, the Russians continue storming operation on the northern flank of the water reservoir. On this video we see more FPV drone strikes against the Ukrainian vehicles, tanks, support machines, strongholds, buildings. So a lot of geolocated videos, and also we got the information that the Ukrainians, the group of Ukrainians in Georgievka direction, took a decision to surrender. The Russians captured them. Now there's no problem and no risk for their lives. They were evacuated to Donetsk. So as we can see, the front line is collapsing slowly, step by step, and the Russians may have very high chances to collapse the entire northern flank of Ukrainian defense in Georgievka and to move further in direction of, let's say, in many directions. Now we are moving to probably one of the most important footholds, to Novomykhailivka. If you remember, yesterday we've just discussed that the Russians attacked the Ukrainian positions somewhere from the fields in this area. We got just one geolocation and one photo, geolocation of destroyed Ukrainian tanks somewhere here, and we had one photo of like concentration of Russian tanks in this area, but we didn't know for sure how exactly that operation ended. And today a lot of mappers, pro-Ukrainian and neutral ones, updated their maps. For example, on this video, Syriac shows that Ukrainians took a decision to withdraw their positions further to the western, let's say, defense belt, to the western road. So if we take a look at the map, according to him, the Ukrainians withdraw from these three lines and they move to the road between Novomykhailivka and, let's say, Побeda. So they left their positions here, and now they try to establish defense belt along this line. The French Ascent Resources reported that the Russians managed to establish control not just over these three lines, but also, according to the French, let's say, Ascent Resources, the Russians managed to establish control over something like this. No, even not like this, but even something like this. So all this territory was captured by the Russians, and not just these two strongholds, but also the Zveriny stronghold and so on. Very difficult to understand who is right, who is wrong. We don't have any geolocations in those trenches, but anyway, as I understand, the progress there is a progress, and the Russians continue offensive operation, and the situation for the Ukrainians develops very, let's say, negative way. Obviously, they will be forced to step back further to the west, and there are and now the main and the most important part of this operation starts. And the first thing is that there is a river, a very small one, but it's at least some water barrier. This is the area that is very difficult to cross, so to bypass this territory. And if the Russians are able to get control over this territory to reach this road, then the Ukrainians will lose their logistic, let's say, along this line. Of course, during the winter period of time, maybe they're gonna have some possibilities to let's say, cross this area and to manipulate with their forces from one side to another, but if not, they will be forced to make a hook, which will lead to logistical issues and problems and losses during this redeployment. So everything develops in Russian favor on the northern direction. And now we're moving to the southern area. If you remember, during the previous days, we have already discussed that according to some mappers and centers, the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish control over these tree lines and these, let's say, fields. And today we got update that the Russians start bombing further to the west, the same area, with cluster rounds, with artillery, with multi-launch rocket systems. Obviously, the Russians are trying to suppress, to destroy and pin down the Ukrainian strongholds, Ukrainian positions, and which will ease the further movements of the Russian forces to the west from Salotka to Vodyana. So the Russians obviously currently do have some plans to continue movements in this direction, and the main purpose of this attack, the main purpose of these movements is not just to, let's say, to force the Ukrainians to step back, to make some plan. The easiest explanation of this attack is that on the southern flank of Konstantinovka and Novomykhailivka there is another water barrier. This is another river, and the river ends somewhere here. So this is the river, and this is the reason why the Ukrainians have created this stronghold to the south west from Novomykhailivka, this one, because from one side this stronghold is protected by the village itself, and from the southern one this village is protected by the water, so it's like a water barrier. But now this situation, this configuration plays in Russian favor, because if the Russians are able to establish control over additional, let's say, lines of trees and fields like this one, then they will be able, the Russians, to establish, let's say, to secure their northern flank, because from now on the Ukrainians will lose their possibilities to attack the Russians, because they will dig in deeper like this. The southern flank of Novomykhailivka will be completely secured. The Russians will create more trenches, or they will capture the Ukrainian trenches. And basically from this perspective, from this point of time, the Ukrainians will lose their possibilities to attack the Russians in their flanks. Because it's like they will have these possibilities, but they will lose. Obviously they will lose. So that's why we cannot expect these attacks. And from the other side, it allows the Russians to continue movements from Salotka to Vodyana without any, let's say, barriers from the north, without any counterattacks from the north, and of course no attacks from the south, because there are Russian positions, just the Ukrainian positions in front of them. It is not very difficult operation in comparison with, let's say, Avdiivka operation or Sinkovka offensive operation. Of course, this is not an easy job, but it is much easier in comparison with, say, even with the ground operation in Novomykhailivka. The Russians will be able to move along the fields, and of course the main purpose of this attack is to get as close as possible to this road and to cut the supply between Vodyana, Ugledar, Konstantinovka, Novomykhailivka. They need to get as close as possible. Probably the Russians need to get at least to this line, and if they can do this, and there are still a job to do, but months, probably months with this speed, if they get this line, then this road will be established fire control. This road will be cut from the logistic system of Ukraine, and obviously the Ukrainian positions to the south also will be collapsed. So another very interesting and smart plan of the Russians. As you can see, the commander of these forces took a decision not to fight in Novomykhailivka. He took a decision to block Novomykhailivka from the south, from the north, to ruin Ukrainian logistic, to increase the logistic shoulder, and to start movements from different directions. And now he got significant results. Well, now we are moving further to Zaporizhia area. We have updated the map according to geolocations we have. The Russians published the video how they were storming this area. Now this territory adjusted as the area in the gray zone. Once again, it's not enough to, let's say, capture the stronghold or to force the Ukrainians to withdraw their positions. It's not enough. The most important is to repel after mass counter-offensive operation. Ukrainians obviously this night or the next morning will counter-attack, and if the Russians are able to repel upcoming counter-offensive operation, then we can change the color. Now we are moving to Kherson direction. We have a lot of very interesting details and updates, and the most important ones are coming from the Kherson and the cities along the Dnipro River. The Russians start massive use of FAB 1500 with the guided module. This is the strongest, the most powerful aviation bomb in the special military operation. It can fly within a distance of from 30 to 50 kilometers, and the explosion is very heavy. The Russians used one on the islands between Lvova, Burgunka, Korsunka, and the second FAP 1500 with guided module was used in the vicinity of Kherson. The Russians used this type of weapon before, but those were like test examples, and now this is the real production examples of, let's say, of endless and, let's say, hugest Russian production ever. Furthermore, the Russians destroyed few Ukrainian artillery systems, continue counter-artillery duels on this area, where they were pretty successful. Few artillery systems, armored vehicles were destroyed, and the Russians continued destroying the Ukrainian forces along the rivers. Significant number of boats were shot down and destroyed by the Russian FPV drones, which also caused significant problems for Ukrainian forces on the ground in Krynki, in the vicinity of Dachi, and of course in the area or in the south of Pridniprovskaya. Other important updates are coming from Odessa and Nikolaev. Today, the Russian sources and the Ukrainian sources published lots of videos from these two cities, how more recruiters were capturing Ukrainian soldiers. And as you can see, one of these guys even was very aggressive with a woman, and he pushed her back not to, like, say, ruin his job. And the second video we got from Odessa, another act of democracy somewhere in the bus. Ukrainian soldiers entered the bus and start taking out men that were moving to their job, and now they will not move to job ever. They will move to the front line, to Avdiivka or something like this. And another important note about the mobilization: as you can see, the Ukrainians, at least we are receiving, if we increase the numbers of updates, let's say since the beginning of December, you're going to see that the concentration of, let's say, mobilization videos we are receiving from the Western Ukraine, from the area that are close to Hungary and Slovakia, so the area where we can find a lot of native people who has, like, not passport, but who has relatives in Hungary and Slovakia, and who, according to passport, has this nationality. They're living in Ukraine, they're Ukrainians, but according to the roots, they're Hungarians and Slovakians. And the Ukrainians are trying to mobilize them as many as possible. And we see the mobilization process on the southern part of Ukraine in Odessa and Nikolaev, the cities that, according to the Russians, according to Putin, they're planning to return back to Russia because these cities are the cities of Russia or something like this. And we have lots of videos of mobilization from Kharkiv, from another Russian city that Russia calls that this is Russian city. So as you can see, the Ukrainians are not mobilizing people from the area that are considering themselves as the root native Ukrainians, just Hungarians, Slovakians, Russians, and many other nationalities. Of course, Ukrainians are going, but they try to concentrate as much as possible exactly in these regions. Very interesting. So we'll see whether it's going to help them or not. And that's it for today. Military Summer Channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.